welcome back to my channel. I thought I'd do another video carrying on talking about the National Autistic Society mental health conference, because there's so much I want to say. I just had a bath, so my hair's wet, hence why I've got my hood up. You know what, I actually hate having baths. Sensory, I don't like having baths, it's like a chore, and I hate having it, it takes ages to brush my hair. But anyway, so I've got a bit of time, so I just thought I'd do carrying on talking about the mental health conference. So I got up to Emily Katy. Now Emily Katy was another autistic speaker at the conference. She was the youngest person at the conference. She's only 20 years old. And she was diagnosed when she was 16, so quite late still. In actual fact, all of the speakers were diagnosed late. But yeah, Emily Katy was the youngest one there, and she was talking mainly about her experiences. She was actually sectioned, which obviously I've never experienced, so it was quite interesting to hear what that was like. She was sectioned because she was self-harming, and she first presented to mental health services when she was 13 with panic attacks, which then sort of like escalated. Her mental health got worse, but it wasn't until she was 16 that she was actually diagnosed autistic. And she now does a lot of self-advocacy work. She's got a blog. She does a lot of talks about autism, which she says is her special interest. There seems to be quite a common theme of autistic people, particularly those who get diagnosed late, where autism becomes their special interest. So Emily Katy, she was sectioned on a CAMS ward, so that's a Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service ward, and then she was diagnosed autistic. She had years of mental health difficulties. After her discharge, she joined the CAMS, at Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services Young People Council, to improve services, and she was also elected governor for her NHS Mental Health Trust when she was 16. In 2021, she became a trustee for a new charity called the Autistic Girls Network, which tries to help autistic girls, which advocates for autistic girls and women in improving diagnosis and things like that. She's currently a third-year student as a student mental health nurse. So she first presented to services aged 13 with panic attacks, and she ran away from school on several occasions, but she did not meet criteria for CAMS at this time, so she was referred to early intervention services. She has 6 weeks of cognitive behavioural therapy, and she was then discharged. When she explained that she was anxious doing certain things, for example going into her dining room because it was too loud and busy, which she said was a strong hint that she might be autistic, the therapist would say, "But don't you think everyone feels a bit like that?" which completely invalidated her experiences, as it only seemed to be her walking on the floor of the dining hall at lunchtime having a panic attack. Now I can relate to what she was saying there and that frustration, where well-meaning professionals, not just professionals, anyone really, but it's often well-meaning professionals, will kind of trivialise autistic experience. Obviously at this point she hadn't yet received a diagnosis, but trivialise not just autistic experience then, but like all experience, because obviously I didn't know she was autistic at this point, but often mental health professionals, trying to be well-meaning, will come out with things such as, "But don't you think everyone feels a bit like that?" That should be the number one, if you like, basically I think what's happening here is that people often are trying to be empathetic by saying, "Oh, but don't you think everyone feels like that?" But it's an attempt at empathy which misfires, and actually the end result is really that they're not really expressing empathy. So they're trying to be empathetic, but actually they're not being empathetic, because true empathy would be actually listening and validating. When you say, "But don't you think everyone feels a bit like that?" it can come across as very invalidating when someone is trying to express an experience that is kind of quite extreme or maybe different to other people, and they need kind of help and recognition of their own sort of what they're going through, without it being trivialised or invalidated by comparing it to other people. So people are trying to be empathetic because I guess the intention is, "Oh, well, if we try and say, "But don't you think everyone experienced this?" that will kind of make you feel less alone. So I think that might be the intent of the people saying that, but actually it backfires because it comes out the other way, and actually really true empathy is just listening and validating. And so I can relate to her, because I've had similar experiences of people like invalidating when I'm talking about things that are to do with my autism. And what's even worse is that the person knows I'm autistic, so it really suggests an ignorance about autism. So I've had support workers before. Like one time I was trying to talk about my special interest, one of my previous special interests in the actress Kate Winslet when I was a teenager, which was really, as I've talked about previously in my videos, which was really, 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 really intense and really obsessive. And basically not like your standard teenage interest. I mean, many teenage girls are interested, not just teenage girls, but teenagers in general are often interested in celebrities and things like that, and that's very common and normal. But the difference is that my interest was so extreme and obsessive. It was like way more obsessive than your average teenage interest. Because person was like, well, everyone as a teenager gets rather obsessive and like and that seems pretty normal. And I then had to explain how actually this was one of the key traits of my autism, and was one of the main things that helped me get a diagnosis, alongside obviously all the other things. But actually it wasn't your typical teenage interest. It was quite extreme. It was basically way beyond what your average teenage girl would be interested in terms of the way I went about that interest. So the focus might have been not that unusual, but actually I say, no, actually in some places the focus was even a bit unusual thinking of it. Both the focus and intensity in some places, in a way I got so obsessed with it. And it was quite unusual, and it's what my parents noticed, and So I just sometimes feel that people are trying to be well-meaning, but actually it can come across as like they trivialise and can make you feel invalidated and not really listened to when you're trying to get something across to do with your condition. And I just feel that professionals need to think more about how they're trying to express their empathy, and it's best, if you're really wanting to be empathetic, is to try and listen and actually validate, and not trying to compare and contrast, because that can actually feel quite invalidating. So I can relate to Emily Katy there, yes. So age 16, she was sectioned, she was self-harming, and she has, and also suicide attempts, and she had OCD. She was an inpatient on a CAMHS ward twice. She was misdiagnosed with a personality disorder. I think she said it was borderline personality disorder, which is now known as an emotionally unstable personality disorder, but that's apparently it's quite common for autistic women to be misdiagnosed with that, because some of the traits can overlap. And also one of the doctors actually saw that she had good grades and friends, and decided that she just had high social anxiety. She says that viewing autism in a medical model is questionable, and she also says that self-diagnosis is valid. Now I disagree with her there, because I do feel that autism does sit within the medical model, and like I said in my previous videos, the medical model isn't unproblematic, and it does need to be looked at with a critical lens, and there are some reactionary elements of the medical model that we do need to do away with, and it complements the social model, but I don't see them as opposites. I see them as mutually compatible, that they can work together, the best of both. I am very, very against self-diagnosis, as I talked about elsewhere, but we won't go into that now. I think that trivialises the seriousness of autism, that it is a clinical diagnosis. You do need a medical professional to validate it. It's not something you could just on a whim say, oh, I'm autistic, I'm going to self-diagnose. I know that people don't do that generally. They spend a lot of time researching and things before they come to the conclusion they might be autistic. But saying you might be autistic is 100% different to saying I am autistic because I say so. You need to get that validated by a professional before you can say you are autistic, in my opinion. So I disagree with her there. She says, knowing you're autistic is obviously good for liberation and understanding. She does point to the harm caused also by lack of formal diagnosis, which seems to be a bit ironic when she says that self-diagnosis is valid, but then she talks about the harm caused by lack of formal diagnosis. I'm not sure you can really be confident enough in yourself to say you are autistic without getting that validated, and really, in order to be fully secure, you need to get diagnosis, really, I would say. And I don't think other people can be expected to take you seriously without a professional diagnosis. You can say you might be, but that's 100% different to saying you are. Saying you might be is fine. You know, you have to first of all think you might be something before you pursue a diagnosis. After all, I mean, before I got diagnosed, I was strongly thinking I might be autistic, and my parents were saying that they thought I might be autistic, and it was my parents who first came to that understanding. But obviously, until I had the diagnosis, I couldn't be 100% certain, and I couldn't self-diagnose myself because that would just be, in my view, wrong and dishonest. Yeah, that's my opinion. She says that autism is a disability, and obviously I agree with her there. You know, autism is a disability, but she says that autism is a disability, but not a bad thing. So something can be a disability and not a bad thing. And again, I agree with her there. I think some people seem to think that just because a disability is a bad thing, and they want to kind of shy away from disability. But I actually feel that's quite reactionary and also quite ableist, because it's kind of distancing yourself from, oh, we're not like them over there sort of thing. And I do feel that, you know, we need to, in a sense, reclaim the word disability. It's not a bad thing, it's just a fact of life, you know? So you can be disabled, but that's not a bad thing, it's not a tragedy, it's just a fact of life, you know? People see disability as something negative, it's not negative, it's just a fact of life, and it doesn't define your whole being. It's just a fact, it's just part of your it's just part of your relationship to society in a way, you know? You're excluded from certain things, you have an impediment, but it doesn't define your whole being, it doesn't limit you in every respect, you know? It's just describing a fact of life, and I just don't think it's helpful to kind of shy away from reality like that. So I agree with her. It's a disability, but it's not a bad thing. I agree with her there. She also talks about how autism is not linear. So, in other words, it's not like a linear spectrum. It's not like you're not autistic and then you're very autistic to very autistic sort of. You're only a bit autistic to very autistic sort of thing. It's more a colour wheel, a bit like what Sarah McCulloch was also arguing, you know, talking about a colour wheel or a strengths wheel, however you want to call it, where you have different traits such as language, motor skills, sensory, executive perception, and then different autistics will score more or less highly on those different traits. So they'll have different intensities on those different traits. So as opposed to seeing autism as something linear, you have to look at each trait and how that affects the person, because people will score differently on different traits. So you have to kind of break autism down instead of looking at it as a composite in a way, and because people are affected differently in different ways depending on what traits they have or the extent of those traits, and autism isn't just one thing, you know. Kind of agree with that, yeah. I won't go into that now, but I can see her point. She draws upon Rebecca Burgess's comic for Spectrum. So yeah, each segment is a different intensity for different autistics. She says that her issues were viewed through a personality disorder lens before she was diagnosed autistic. And then she looks at what other autistic people say. What other autistic people say would be helpful. People that I presume she'd interviewed or talked to about their experiences. And she quotes directly from them. So one autistic said, for example, something I think would be helpful would be for professionals to stop saying things like, I don't think that's an autism thing, I think that's a human thing, when we try and explain our differences or advocate for ourselves. Yeah, again, as I said earlier, people do that to try and be well-meaning, but it comes across as incredibly trivialising, and you wouldn't do that for any other disability or condition, I don't think. Like, you wouldn't try and trivialise someone who had a back problem or someone who had, I don't know, in a wheelchair or something. You say, I sometimes find it a little bit difficult to walk, you know, in the morning. You know, that's just a normal thing, that's just a human thing. Sometimes I'm a bit stiff when I get out of bed. You wouldn't do that, would you? So why do people feel it's acceptable to do that for autistic people? When I feel they need to think twice, really. They need to think about it, because they're trying to be empathetic, but it's really the opposite of empathy, actually. She says that autistics might be happy or sad because it's not always reflected on their faces, because autistics don't always express how they feel inside on their faces. So they might be feeling, say, very upset or very sad, but your face might not be displaying that emotion in a way people expect. So you shouldn't assume that autistic isn't feeling sad just because their face isn't displaying it, for example. and then obviously again not taken seriously. She says that mindfulness is not a panacea for all, because mindfulness is often a sort of go-to kind of therapy du jour these days. But she says, mindfulness is not a panacea for all. For autism, it can be really stressful being made to focus on sensations, and stillness is not always relaxing. Sometimes movement can soothe your nervous system more. Yeah, I agree with her there. I struggle with mindfulness because I find sometimes actually focusing on my breath can actually make me more anxious because I'm already hypersensitive to what's going on inside. It already causes me a lot of anxiety. I sometimes have thankfully not that often these days, but I do sometimes get in states of panic, and focusing on what's going on like that can actually sometimes cause more anxiety because I'm so sensitive to what's going on both inside and outside. It can actually sometimes cause more anxiety. So I sometimes find mindfulness in that way doesn't help me. And what helps me more, stillness isn't always relaxing. I quite like to move around. So I find what helps me more is actually doing mindful activities like painting and things like that, where you're focusing on something, getting to a state of flow. I find that far more helpful than just kind of that sort of stillness meditation. But that's often prescribed, as therapists often prescribe it, thinking it's going to be suitable for everyone, and it isn't. So yeah, I think that was all of her talk, really. Yeah, I think I covered that. So I'm going to move on to video number 2 now. To carry on covering what's talked about at the conference, so moving on to video number 2.